express their emotions or the things they cannot put into words through drawings, their fears, their joys, even their darkest secrets. But sometimes they simply draw what is familiar, what they see, what they experience. If a child draws someone their family doesn't know, there might be a disturbing truth behind that drawing. This video contains some of the most unsettling stories hidden within children's drawings. Lena was 7 years old and loved to draw. Her room was filled with her artwork. Rainbows, flowers, animals, children playing in the park. Her mother had always encouraged Lena's love for art. She bought her the best colored pencils and even let her decorate the walls with her drawings. Lena's pictures were usually cheerful. But one day, her mother looked at Lena's latest drawing and felt a chill run down her spine. The picture showed Lena. Her mother and father were there too, but standing between them was a stranger, a tall woman with pale skin. "Who is this, sweetheart?" her mother asked, taking the paper from Lena's hands. Lena looked up and smiled. "The woman who comes to my room every night before I fall asleep." Her mother's chest tightened. "What do you mean, Lena? Who is she?" Lena shrugged. "Her name is Anna. She sits next to my bed and talks to me every night." Her mother assumed it was just Lena's imagination. After all, children sometimes create imaginary friends. But Lena kept drawing Anna. She was in every picture. In one, Lena and her family were having a picnic in the park. Anna stood behind a tree watching. In another, Lena was in the living room. But outside the window, Anna was staring in. The most unsettling one showed Anna standing right next to Lena's bed. One night, while looking through her daughter's drawings, Lena's mother noticed something. Anna was getting closer. At first, she was in the corner of the drawing, then at the front door, in another, inside the living room, and in the last one, inside Lena's bedroom, standing right next to her bed. Over time, Lena began labeling her drawings. She wrote her own name as Lena, her mother as Mom, and her father as Dad. And in every picture there was another name, Anna. "Lena, who is Anna?" her mother asked one evening. Lena didn't hesitate for a second. "She loves me, but she doesn't talk to you or Dad. She only talks to me." Her mother felt her breath catch in her throat. "And what does she tell you?" Lena lowered her head. "She says, you and Dad don't love me." From that night on, Lena's mother decided she would sleep in her daughter's room. She didn't like the idea of Lena being so affected by this imaginary figure. That night, she sat on the chair next to Lena's bed, turned off the light, and stayed with her until she fell asleep. But around 3 in the morning, she woke up to a sound, a whisper. Lena was sitting up in bed, staring into the corner of the room. Her mother immediately placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Lena didn't blink. She kept staring at the corner. "She's watching me." Her mother froze. "Who?" Lena whispered softly. "Anna." Her mother quickly turned on the light. The room was empty, but Lena never took her eyes off the corner. The next morning, Lena's father also began to worry. They decided to cut off Lena's connection to Anna. They told her, "You won't talk about Anna anymore, sweetheart." But Lena just smiled. "She wanted me to tell you something." Her parents exchanged glances. "What did she want you to tell us?" Lena clasped her hands in front of her and whispered, "She used to live here." "What? Who lived here?" Lena tilted her head. "Anna. This was her house." Lena's parents started researching the history of their home, but no one named Anna had ever lived there. However, before them, another family had owned the house, and they had a daughter, but she had disappeared when she was Lena's age. The night Lena's parents discovered this, she surprised them by saying that she no longer saw Anna. "She's gone?" her mother asked. Lena nodded, but she took too long to answer. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, and with a slow smile she said, "Yes, she's gone." But her voice was strange, it sounded forced. She slowly lowered her head and stared at the floor. Then, Lena's hand started moving. She picked up a pencil and began drawing. Her mother froze. Because on the paper Lena had drawn her parents and Anna, but this time she hadn't drawn herself. Her mother, trembling, picked up the paper. "Lena, what is this?" Lena looked up, her eyes were empty, and in a whisper she answered, "I am Anna." Hannah was 5 years old, and one of her favorite things to do was try to draw the floor plan of their house. Her drawings were surprisingly detailed for her age. The couch in the living room, the kitchen table, the direction of the windows, she replicated everything almost exactly on paper. Her mother always admired Hannah's talent. "You're a little architect," she would joke. But in Hannah's latest drawing, something caught her attention. A door. It was placed in the corner of the drawing, somewhere between the kitchen and the hallway. But there was no such door in their home. "Hannah, this door isn't in our house," her mother said with a smile. Hannah didn't lift her head from her drawing. "It is," she replied, "but it only opens at night." That answer made her mother uneasy. "What do you mean?" she asked. Hannah tapped her pencil against her lips, thinking for a moment, then leaned over the paper again. "It stays closed until morning, but at night it opens. Not always. Sometimes." Her mother dismissed it as part of Hannah's imagination, but a strange feeling settled in her stomach. That evening, as she walked through the kitchen, she glanced at the corner Hannah had marked in her drawing. There was nothing there but a solid wall. And yet, the idea that there should be a door in that exact spot wouldn't leave her mind. That night, around 3 a.m, a sound woke her up. It was faint, like a tapping against the wall from the next room. At first, she thought she was dreaming. But no, she was completely awake. The sound was coming from the kitchen. She sat up in bed, blinking. Silence. Then, the sound again. A sudden chill ran through her body. She thought about the door Hannah had drawn, and a deep unease settled in her chest. She whispered to herself, "Don't be ridiculous." But despite her reasoning, her heartbeat quickened. She got out of bed, peeked into Hannah's room to check on her. The little girl was fast asleep, bundled tightly under her blanket, breathing softly. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the kitchen. When she stepped inside, everything was in its place. Plates on the stove, cups by the sink. Everything looked perfectly normal. And yet, something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but instinctively it felt wrong. She leaned against the fridge, standing in the middle of the kitchen, listening. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the corner Hannah had drawn. There was no door, just a wall. But she didn't feel any relief. Eventually, she convinced herself she was being ridiculous. She took a deep breath, turned off the light, and went back to bed. But once she lay down, she couldn't close her eyes. The next morning, Hannah was sitting at the breakfast table, drawing again. Her mother leaned over her shoulder and glanced at the new picture. The door was still there, but this time it was different. In her previous drawings, the door had only been an outline. This time, it was open, and the inside was colored in solid black. Her mother felt a tightness in her chest. She held her breath but forced a smile onto her face. "Hannah, why is the door open?" Hannah kept drawing, adding a few more details. "Because it opened last night," she said calmly. A shiver ran down her mother's spine. She loved her daughter's imagination, but Hannah's drawings had been getting strange. Still, she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Hannah twirled her crayon between her fingers and answered, "At night, sometimes it opens. Last night, it did. That's why I drew it like this." Her mother looked closer at the drawing. The doorway was filled with solid black, but the most unsettling part was the small figure standing inside it. A tall, thin silhouette, pitch black with no details. Her throat tightened. "Hannah, who is inside the door?" The little girl paused. tilting her head as if she were trying to find the right word. Then she smiled. "I don't know yet." Her mother flinched. Yet. The unease in her chest grew. But Hannah remained calm, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Not wanting to alarm her daughter, she slowly leaned back. But inside, her mind was racing. Tonight, she would wait. Tonight, she would watch the corner where Hannah said the door was. That night, after putting Hannah to bed, she stood in the doorway of her room and asked, "Hannah, will the door open tonight?" The little girl thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I don't know. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't." That answer made her mother even more unsettled. Once Hannah was asleep, she dragged a chair into the kitchen and sat in the corner. The night went on. Hours passed. Everything was silent. She began to feel ridiculous. Hannah was just a child. This was just a trick of her imagination, right? At 3:12 a.m. she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible clicking sound. She froze in her chair. Silence. Then again. Thud. Someone, or something, was knocking against the wall, right where the door was supposed to be. Her breath quickened. She was too afraid to move. Hannah's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes it opens." Suddenly, a chair on the other side of the kitchen toppled over. It crashed onto the floor with a sharp clatter. She jumped to her feet, her heart hammering. She had no idea what was happening, but instinctively her eyes darted to the corner. There was still no door, just a solid wall, but something was there. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. Without thinking, she bolted to Hannah's room, climbed into bed beside her, and pulled her daughter close. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. She didn't know what had just happened. Maybe she would never know, but something was there. The next morning, as Hannah sat at the breakfast table, her mother took a look inside her sketchbook. When she saw the last drawing, the color drained from her face. The door was now completely open, and the figure inside was no longer behind the door. It was in the middle of the living room. And at the bottom of the page, in small, childlike handwriting, Hannah had written 4 words. "It lives here now." Brian was 7 years old and in 1st grade. More than anything, he loved drawing. While most kids grabbed their crayons and scribbled randomly, Brian always drew detailed pictures that told a story. His teacher, Mr. Reynolds, gave the students a drawing assignment every weekend. Draw your family, draw your favorite place, draw what you did over the weekend. Simple tasks. Most children drew themselves playing in the park, at the zoo, or having a picnic with their families. But Brian's drawings were always simple and colorless. He usually drew his house. A small, square house, 2 windows on top, a door in the middle. The sky was often gray. While other children drew bright suns and fluffy clouds, his pictures were almost always overcast. At first, Mr. Reynolds didn't think much of it. Some children were just more reserved. But one day, while looking at Brian's drawing, his eyes caught something unusual. There was writing on the window of the house. He leaned in closer, focusing on the faint, tiny letters scratched onto the glass. "Help me. Dad gets mad." Mr. Reynolds blinked, thinking he must be seeing it wrong. Brian had just begun learning to read and write. Maybe he had copied the words from somewhere without understanding them. But no, the message was clear. He knelt beside Brian's desk. "This is a wonderful house, Brian," he said gently. "Who wrote the words on the window?" Brian didn't answer at first. He lowered his gaze to the floor and mumbled softly, "I don't know. It just appeared." A chill ran down Mr. Reynolds' spine. Children sometimes told small lies, but not like this. "Is your dad angry at home a lot?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Brian kept staring at the floor. "Sometimes," he whispered. "Sometimes." Brian raised his finger and pointed at the window in his drawing. "It happens a lot here." That was the moment Mr. Reynolds knew for sure. A child wouldn't make something like this up without reason. That day, he went back and looked through Brian's previous drawings. He tried to recall the ones he had seen over the past few weeks. Most of them were of the same house, the same gray sky, but now details he had overlooked before stood out to him. The windows were always blacked out. You could never see inside. There was always someone standing at the door, but they never had a face, just a long, shadow-like figure. In some drawings, there was a small child in the corner, but their face was never visible. As a teacher, Mr. Reynolds couldn't ignore what he had seen. He went to the school counselor and explained the situation. He showed them Brian's drawings. The school administration took action immediately. A meeting was scheduled with Brian's family. His mother came alone. His father was not with her. She looked exhausted and tense. "How is Brian? Is everything okay at home?" they asked. His mother instantly replied, "Yes, everything is fine," but her eyes darted away nervously. Then the counselor placed Brian's most recent drawing on the table. The woman looked at it. Then at the words in the window. She placed her hands on the table. Her fingers trembled slightly. And when she finally looked up, her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I need help too." That day, social services stepped in. Brian's mother admitted that for years, both she and her son had suffered abuse at home, but she had been too afraid of her husband's threats to tell anyone. Brian had been crying out for help in the only way he knew how, but he wouldn't have spoken up unless someone asked. Instead, he had drawn it, because sometimes children hide in their drawings the things they cannot say out loud. And the small message Brian had written on the window, maybe it was also his mother's silent cry for help. Brian and his mother were placed in a process that removed his father from their home. With the school's support, Brian was given therapy, and after a while, his drawings changed. The sky was blue, the windows were clear, and for the first time, there were smiling faces in Brian's house.